She was 19 years old, standing in chains, and not one person in that crowd would meet her eyes. The auctioneer's hammer hovered in the cold morning air. The gang had already sold 3 men before breakfast. Now they wanted her land, and when she'd refused to sign it away, they'd decided to sell her instead. Black Ash Crossing had seen ugly things, but nothing like this. The townspeople pressed against the walls of buildings, hats pulled low, boots pointed at the ground. Afraid, silent, useless. Then, hoofbeats. Slow, unhurried, like whoever was coming had all the time in the world. Every outlaw in that square turned around. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're in the right place. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Black Ash Crossing, October 1878. The frost came early that year. It crept down from the ridge sometime in the night, settled over the rooftops of Black Ash Crossing, and by the time Elena Voss was dragged out of the old trading post and into the square, the ground beneath her bare feet was hard as iron and cold enough to burn. She had no shoes. They'd taken those when they took everything else. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rope that had already worn the skin raw. Her dark hair, usually pinned back, hung loose around her face. She'd been sleeping when they came for her, and nobody had given her time to do much of anything before they pulled her out of the only home she had left, which wasn't even much of a home anymore. 4 walls of old sod, a leaking roof, a cook stove that ran cold half the time. But it sat on 40 acres of bottomland her father had broken his back clearing, and her mother had planted, and both of them had died on. That land was the only thing Elena had refused to give up. That refusal was why she was standing here now. The square in Black Ash Crossing wasn't much. A wide patch of dirt road that widened between the feed store, the saloon, the shuttered bank, and what used to be the telegraph office before the Halloran gang cut the lines. There was a wooden platform in the middle of it, maybe 4 feet off the ground, that had been built for a different kind of auction entirely. Livestock, grain contracts, the ordinary business of a frontier settlement that was trying, slowly, to become something. The Hallorans had turned it into something else. There were maybe 120 people gathered around the edges of that square, and not one of them was there by choice. The gang had sent riders through the streets at dawn, banging on doors, ordering everyone out. Attendance wasn't optional. Marcus Halloran believed in audiences. He said it kept people honest. What he meant was that it kept people scared, and scared people didn't organize, and people who didn't organize didn't come after you in the night with torches and hunting rifles. So the town of Black Ash Crossing stood in the cold morning and watched. Elena was pushed up the steps of the platform by a man named Cutter, who was one of Marcus Halloran's lieutenants and who smelled like he hadn't washed since summer. He shoved her between the shoulder blades hard enough that she stumbled, caught herself on the edge of the railing, and turned around to face the crowd. She recognized almost every face out there. Amos Hecht, who ran the feed store. The Morrow sisters, who had a small ranch 3 miles east. Old Doc Pruitt, who had delivered half the children in town over the last 20 years. Pearl Dunbar from the saloon. The Garza family, mother, father, 3 kids. Pastor Wills, though Elena's feelings about him were complicated. Ned Burrell, who used to work her father's land before he got scared off. None of them looked at her. Not one. They studied the ground, the sky, their own hands. A few of the children were being held against their mother's sides with a firmness that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with keeping small mouths shut. Elena understood. She did. She wasn't angry at them the way another person might have been. She'd lived in this territory long enough to know what fear did to people, how it narrowed them, folded them inward, made them small in ways they didn't want to be but couldn't help. The Hallorans had been working this end of the territory for 3 years. They'd burned the Kettrick homestead when Tom Kettrick tried to organize a complaint to the county sheriff. They'd shot 2 of the Bauer brothers when the Bauers decided to stop paying protection tax on their cattle. They'd run the sheriff out of town themselves 14 months ago, and nobody had replaced him. You did not survive in Black Ash Crossing by making yourself visible. Elena had survived this long by being careful, by keeping her head down, by being the kind of person people forgot was there. But there was one thing she wouldn't do, and that was sign her name to a paper that said the Halloran gang owned her family's land. She'd been asked 3 times. The first time, she'd said no quietly. The second time, she'd said no with a little more edge in it. The third time, a man named Diggs had come to her door at midnight with a torch in one hand and the deed transfer in the other, and Elena had taken the shotgun down from above the door and told him she would burn with the house before she'd sign anything. Diggs had gone back and told Marcus Halloran what she'd said. Marcus Halloran had apparently found that funny. He wasn't laughing now, though. He was standing at the base of the platform with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, watching her the way you'd watch something you'd already decided what to do with. Marcus Halloran was not a large man. That surprised people sometimes. He was maybe 5'9", lean, with the kind of forgettable face that made you work to remember it afterward. The danger in him wasn't physical, it was something colder, a quality of complete indifference to other people's pain that read, from a distance, almost like calm. He nodded at the auctioneer. The auctioneer was a man named Griff, who the gang had brought in from somewhere north. He had a voice like a riverboat captain, big, carrying, the kind of voice that filled space without seeming to try. He stepped up beside Elena, spread his hands to the crowd, and smiled like none of this was anything. "People of Black Ash Crossing," he said, "thank you for joining us this fine October morning." A few people flinched at the word fine. The cold was the kind that got inside your coat. As you know, the Halloran organization has been working hard to bring order and stability to this territory. Land consolidation is part of that effort. When a property owner, and here he gestured at Elena without looking at her directly, like she was a problem on a ledger sheet, refuses to cooperate with the legal process of transfer, alternative arrangements must be made. Legal process. Elena almost laughed. The deed transfer documents the Hallorans used had been drawn up by a man named Potts, who called himself a lawyer and was one about as much as Elena was a circus performer. They weren't legal. They'd never been filed anywhere official. They were just paper with words on them, and in a territory with no functioning law, paper with words was almost as good as real. The young lady's property, 43 acres of bottom land along Cutter Creek, will be transferred to Halloran Holdings by end of day, regardless, Griff continued, projecting cheerfully to the crowd. But the matter of the young lady herself presents an opportunity. He turned to her then, and his smile stayed exactly where it was. It was the most unsettling thing Elena had seen in a long time, and she'd seen quite a bit. "Starting bid," he said, "is $50. Someone in the crowd made a sound. Just a small one. A sharp intake of breath, quickly smothered. Elena didn't look to see who it was. She was looking at Marcus Halloran, who was looking back at her, and she was trying to understand what was going to happen to her in the next hour, and what, if anything, she could do about it. $50. She'd known this was a possibility. When Diggs had come back that third night and she'd held the shotgun on him, she'd known the next step would be worse than the last one. The Hallorans ran a trafficking operation alongside the land fraud. Everyone in the territory knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. Men and women who couldn't be bought or threatened disappeared into the backcountry and turned up later, sometimes far away, sometimes not at all. There were buyers out there. There were always buyers. She'd told herself she was ready for this. Standing on the platform in the cold with her wrists bleeding slightly from the rope, she wasn't entirely sure that had been true. "Do I hear 50? Griff called out. Silence from the crowd. Elena watched the people she'd grown up alongside keeping their eyes down, their mouths shut. A man near the back, one of the Halloran riders planted there, she was almost certain, called out, 50. $50, Griff confirmed pleasantly. Do I hear 60? The platform was rough wood under her feet. Elena could feel every splinter. She was trying to breathe normally, trying to keep her face from showing what was happening inside her chest, which was something between terror and rage and a strange, dull grief. Not for herself exactly, but for all the things she wasn't going to get to do. The garden she'd planned for spring. The letter she'd been meaning to write to her mother's sister up in Colorado, who probably didn't know her sister was dead. Small things. The kind of things you only missed once they were gone. 60, someone else called, another plant. The bidding was theater, she understood, designed to make the crowd feel like they were watching commerce rather than a crime. 75, a third voice. Elena looked at the auctioneer's hammer. It was a real auctioneer's hammer, the kind with a wooden head and a turned handle. She wondered briefly if there was any scenario in which she could get to it and do something useful with it before Cutter got to her. The answer was almost certainly no. Cutter was standing 2 feet behind her right shoulder, and he was paying attention. The bidding climbed to $120. Outside the planted voices, no one in the crowd moved or spoke. Griff raised the hammer. "Going once," he said. "Going—" The hoofbeats were so unhurried that Elena almost didn't register them as anything significant at first. Just a single horse, walking, in no particular hurry. The sound of it came from the north end of the square, from the direction of the road that led out toward the ridge and the open territory beyond. And then the crowd shifted. It wasn't dramatic, nobody ran, nobody screamed. It was more like a slow parting of water. The people standing at the edge of the square near the north road stepped back, and then the people behind them stepped back, not quickly but steadily, like something was pushing them out of the way by simply existing near them. Marcus Halloran straightened up. Cutter said under his breath, "What in the—" A horse and rider came around the corner of the feed store and into the square. A gray horse, trail dusty, moving at a walk with its head up and its ears forward. The rider sat easy in the saddle, one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't appear to be reaching for one. He just rode into the square like a man who'd come to town for supplies and happened to notice an auction was happening. He was maybe 30, 32. Dark coat, worn through at the elbows. A hat that had seen a lot of weather. A jaw that looked like it had been introduced to several fists over the years and had won at least most of those arguments. He had a rifle in a scabbard on the side of the horse and a revolver on his hip, but that wasn't unusual for this part of the territory. What was unusual was the way the Halloran riders responded to him. They stepped back. Not far. Not obvi. Ousely. But Elena had been watching people move around each other in fear her whole life, and she knew what it looked like, even when people were trying to hide it. The Halloran riders who'd been standing loose and comfortable around the edges of the square had shifted, tightened, recalibrated. Their hands were suddenly closer to their guns. Their eyes were tracking the rider the way eyes tracked something they didn't know how to measure. One of the younger riders, a boy who couldn't have been older than 17 and who Elena had heard called Tad, said something to the man next to him. She was too far away to hear it, but she could read the shape of it on his lips. Ronan Creed. She'd heard that name. In the territory, you heard it the same way you heard weather reports, as information about something large and indifferent that existed out there and occasionally moved in your direction. Ronan Creed was a bounty hunter, or had been, or was something more complicated than that. The stories didn't line up. Some said he'd ridden with an outlaw band in his early 20s and then turned on them. Some said he'd been a lawman who'd gone off the rails. Some said he was simply a man who'd made enough enemies in enough places that killing people had become more or less a professional requirement. What all the stories agreed on was that the people who'd tried to collect on the bounties that several outlaw organizations had placed on his head over the years were, to a one, dead. Ronan Creed walked his horse into the middle of the square and stopped. He looked around at the crowd, at the people pressed against the building fronts, at the Halloran riders, at Marcus Halloran himself. His gaze was unhurried, almost bored, like he was taking account. Then he looked at Elena. She looked back at him. She wasn't sure what her face was doing, probably nothing good. He looked at the hammer in Griff's hand, at the rope on Elena's wrists, back at Marcus Halloran. "What's the bid?" he said. His voice was not particularly loud, but it carried in the cold air like a stone dropped in still water. Halloran's jaw tightened. "You're not wanted here, Creed." "I'm usually not wanted wherever I am," Ronan said. "What's the bid?" It wasn't a question. The second time it was a statement, like the answer was already a foregone conclusion. Griff looked at Halloran. Halloran looked at Creed for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man calculating odds he didn't entirely like. 120, Griff said, finally. 121, Creed said. Several things happened at once. A sound went through the crowd. Not quite a gasp, something lower and more complicated than that. Two of the Halloran riders shifted position. Marcus Halloran's face went through several expressions quickly before settling on something carefully blank. Cutter, behind Elena, said, "Son of a—" and stopped himself. Elena stared at the man on the gray horse and thought, he's going to get himself killed. Ronan Creed reached into his coat and came out with a money clip, counted off bills with a practicality that felt almost insulting to the drama of the moment. He looked up, met Halloran's eyes. "I want to talk to you," Creed said, "about a business proposition. The girl goes free while we talk. That's not negotiable." Halloran laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like a door slamming. "You're in no position to set conditions, Creed. I'm in the only position that matters." He glanced around at the riders, doing it slowly, making sure they knew he was counting them. "I count 11 of yours. You want to start something in the middle of town with 120 witnesses? Go ahead. I'll take 7 of yours before I go down, and you know it. And you know I know it." Or, he held up the money clip. "We have a conversation, private, about something worth both our whiles." The square was very quiet. Elena watched Marcus Halloran do the math. She could see it happening, the calculation moving behind his flat eyes. 11 men, 7 down. That left 4, and Halloran was smart enough to know that Creed's estimate was probably conservative. Maybe more importantly, whatever Creed had come to say, it had brought him here willingly, which meant he either had something valuable to offer or was suicidal. Either possibility was more interesting than a shootout in the town square. "Lower your bid," Halloran said. Creed lowered the money clip. Halloran jerked his chin at Cutter. "Release her." Elena felt the rope go slack. She didn't let herself show what that felt like. The sudden sick relief of it, the way her legs wanted to not work correctly for a second. She pulled her wrists apart, felt the rope fall away, and stepped to the edge of the platform and down the steps without assistance, because she was not going to give any of these people the satisfaction of watching her need help. She stood at the base of the platform. Her feet were still bare on the frozen ground. Ronan Creed had dismounted. He was tying his horse to the post outside the feed store, moving with the same unhurried practicality he did everything. He didn't look at her. "Go somewhere warm," he said, to nobody in particular. Or to her. She wasn't sure. She didn't go somewhere warm. She stood where she was. He walked with Halloran into the saloon. The saloon smelled like old smoke and sour beer and something underneath both of those things that Elena couldn't name, but that felt like accumulated bad decisions. She'd slipped in through the back door after watching Cutter lead Ronan and Halloran inside, a door that Pearl Dunbar had showed her once 2 years ago, when Elena had done Pearl a favor that was better left unspecified. Pearl was behind the bar now, polishing glasses with aggressive nonchalance, eyes down, expression saying clearly that she was not going to notice anything that happened in her establishment today. Elena slid into a spot along the back wall, behind a pillar, where she could see without being particularly visible. Ronan Creed was sitting across a table from Marcus Halloran. 2 of Halloran's men were standing behind Halloran, and the young one, Tad, was near the door. Creed sat with his hands on the table, open, which Elena recognized as a calculated gesture. "I'm not reaching for anything. Relax." "You said a business proposition," Halloran said. He had a whiskey in front of him that he wasn't drinking. "I'm listening." "There's a circuit judge," Creed said, "coming through the territory in 6 weeks. Federal appointment, not county. Name's Harlan Pierce. He's been tasked with evaluating land claims in this district, specifically looking into whether property transfers over the last 3 years were conducted legally." The silence that followed was very specific. "Where'd you get that information?" Halloran asked. "Does it matter?" Halloran's jaw worked. "It matters because if it's real, you're sitting on information I'd pay a lot of money to get in front of me privately." "It's real," Creed said. "And you're right that I came here with something to sell. Only it's not information." He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, in a way that made the 2 men behind Halloran reach for their guns before they stopped themselves, and came out with a leather satchel that he set on the table between them. It made a sound when it landed, a heavy, settled sound. "This is a map," he said, "of every federal land claim in this territory, with annotations on which ones have the clearest legal standing and which ones are, let's say, contestable. It also includes the anticipated route Judge Pierce will take, and who he'll be speaking to before his official hearings begin." He let that sit. Halloran looked at the satchel, not at Creed. At the satchel, the way a man looked at something he wanted and didn't entirely trust. "What do you want for it?" Halloran asked. "Partnership," Creed said simply. "You've got the territory. I know the law, specifically the gaps in it. Together we can stay 3 steps ahead of Pierce and anyone else they send out here. Separately, you've got 6 weeks before a federal judge starts asking questions that are going to be very difficult to answer." Another silence. Elena pressed herself against the wall behind the pillar. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold anymore. She was watching Ronan Creed's face, trying to understand what she was seeing. He was lying. She was almost certain he was lying, but she couldn't see a single seam in it. Nothing in his posture or his expression or the way he spoke suggested anything other than a man making a straightforward transaction. Either he was the best liar she'd ever encountered, or there was something she wasn't understanding yet. "You've been working alone a long time," Halloran said. "Why come to me?" "Because you have infrastructure," Creed said. "Men, horses, supply lines. I'm good at what I do, but I'm one man. And because—" He paused, and something shifted slightly in his expression, something that looked almost like honesty, though Elena couldn't tell if that was real or another layer of performance. "I've been hunted for 4 years. I'm tired of it. A man in my position needs protection that a reputation alone doesn't provide." Halloran looked at him for a long time. Then he picked up his whiskey and drank half of it. "You'll stay here," he said, "in the compound, while I verify what you're telling me." "That's acceptable," Creed said. "The girl stays free," Halloran added. "For now. If you're here as a partner, I don't need to make enemies of property owners." He said this like it was a concession, when it was actually just self-interest in slightly different clothes. "That's all I asked," Creed said. Halloran stood, picked up the satchel. "Cutter will show you where to bunk." He walked out of the saloon without looking back. The 2 men behind him followed. Tad lingered by the door for a moment, looking at Creed with a mixture of awe and wariness that he was too young to fully conceal before he followed the others. Pearl Dunbar kept polishing her glass. Creed sat alone at the table. He reached up and rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture so tired and so human that it caught Elena off guard. Then he lowered his hands and stared at the table. He knew she was there. She wasn't sure how. She hadn't made a sound. But after a moment he said, without turning around, "I told you to go somewhere warm." "I don't take instruction well," Elena said. "My mother used to say it was my worst quality." He turned then. In the saloon light, thin, gray, filtered through dirty windows, she got a better look at him than she'd had in the square. The jaw she'd noted was accurate. There were other things, too. A scar running through one eyebrow, eyes that were dark brown and that were currently doing the same kind of calculating that Halloran's eyes did, except that where Halloran's felt cold, Creed's felt. She searched for the word. Tired. That was the one. Like someone who had spent a long time counting exits in every room he walked into and had gotten very good at it and had found no satisfaction in that skill. How much of that was true, she asked. Some of it. The federal judge? There is a federal judge, he said. He exists. Whether he's coming here or not, he shrugged. So you just walked into a gang leader's auction and told him a story. I walked into a gang leader's auction and bought time, he said. Those are different things. He pushed back from the table. He'll send someone to verify what I told him. That gives me 3, maybe 4 days before it falls apart. Longer if I'm careful. Elena looked at him. 3 days to do what? He stood up. He was taller than she'd estimated from the platform. He picked up his hat from the table. He'd set it there when he sat down. And put it back on. Figure that out when I know what I'm working with, he said. He started toward the door. You spent $121 on me, Elena said. He stopped. I'm going to want to know why, she said. When you're ready to tell me the truth. He looked at her over his shoulder. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite categorize. Not amusement, exactly. Not irritation either. Can you ride? He asked. Yes. Can you shoot? Yes. Can you keep your mouth shut when it matters? She thought about the auction platform, about not crying, about standing straight in the cold with her wrists bleeding and her feet frozen to the boards. I think I've demonstrated that today, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Go to your place, he said. Lock the door. Don't talk to anyone about this. I'll find you tomorrow. He walked out. Elena stood in the dim saloon for a moment. Pearl Dunbar set down her glass and her cloth and looked at Elena across the bar with an expression that was not quite readable. You know him? Elena asked. Know of him? Pearl said carefully. Same as everybody. Is it true what they say? Pearl picked up another glass, started polishing. What I know is, she said, 6 years ago, there was a situation over in Harker's Bend that none of us liked to talk about. Operation Running Out of There, selling people, took 3 counties and 2 years to clean out. She set the glass down. Nobody talks about how it got cleaned out. She picked up another glass. The conversation apparently was over. Elena walked out of the saloon and into the cold. The square was clearing to Bram, the crowd dispersing back into their buildings, their silence, their careful non-witnessing. The auction platform stood empty, the hammer still resting on the railing where Griff had set it. She found her shoes where they'd been dropped near the trading post steps. Put them on. Stood up and looked around the square at the town she'd grown up in. The feed store, the shuttered bank, the saloon, the houses with their smoke threads drifting from chimneys, all of it gray and cold and pretending that nothing had happened this morning. She had 43 acres of bottomland that someone wanted badly enough to auction off a human being for. She had 3 days, maybe 4, before whatever Ronan Creed was doing fell apart. She had a name she hadn't known this morning, and a question she needed answered, and the kind of anger that had stopped feeling like anger and started feeling like fuel. Elena Voss put her hands in her pockets and walked home. She didn't look back at the platform, but she counted, from memory, carefully, every face she'd seen in that crowd, every person who'd looked away, every person who'd stood there in the cold and said nothing. She was going to need every single one of them. She just didn't know it yet. Elena didn't sleep. She lay on her cot with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind work its way through the gap in the sod wall she'd been meaning to patch since August. The cold came through it in a thin, steady stream that she usually ignored. Tonight, she couldn't. Tonight, everything felt too loud. The wind, the creak of the roof timbers, the distant sound of horses moving in the direction of the Halloran compound 2 miles north of town. She kept seeing the auctioneer's hammer, the way it had hung in the air, the fraction of a second between going twice and the sound of those hoofbeats. That was how close it had been. She sat up around 2 in the morning, lit the lamp, and sat at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and wrote down every name she could remember from the crowd in the square. She wasn't sure why, exactly. Some instinct she couldn't fully articulate, that the names mattered, that the people who'd stood there were going to matter somehow, even if she didn't know the shape of it yet. She wrote 47 names before she ran out of people she was certain of. Then she folded the paper and put it in the tin box under the floorboard where she kept the land deed and what was left of her mother's jewelry. Then she blew out the lamp and lay back down, and eventually, sometime before dawn, she slept. Ronan Creed knocked on her door at first light. He didn't announce himself, just 3 knocks, evenly spaced, and then silence. Elena was up and at the door in seconds, because she'd been half awake already, listening. She opened it. He was standing on her step with 2 cups of coffee. Actual coffee, not the chicory substitute most of the territory had been drinking since the supply lines got disrupted, and an expression that suggested he'd also not slept much. "Where did you get coffee?" she said. "Pearl. Pearl doesn't give coffee to strangers." "I'm not a stranger to Pearl," he said. He held out one of the cups. She took it, stepped back to let him in, because standing in the doorway in the cold having a conversation seemed like a way to advertise to anyone watching that she had a visitor, and she'd already decided she didn't want that. He came in and looked around the place the way he'd looked around the square yesterday, taking inventory, cataloging exits. There wasn't much to catalog. 1 room, essentially. The cot, the table, the cook stove, a shelf of supplies, a trunk at the foot of the bed. A window facing east that got the morning light. Another window on the north wall that she kept covered with a piece of burlap because it had lost its glass in a hailstorm and she hadn't been able to replace it yet. He noticed the burlap. Noticed the gap in the sod wall. Noticed, she thought, the exact condition of everything in the room, and she felt the particular irritation of having your poverty examined by a stranger, even if the examination was neutral. "Sit down," she said, mostly to redirect the inventory. He sat, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. She sat across from him and did the same. "Tell me what you're actually doing," she said. "All of it." He drank his coffee first. She waited. She'd decided somewhere around 2 in the morning that she was not going to push him, not going to fill silences with words just because they were uncomfortable. Her mother had told her once that the people who couldn't stand silence were the ones who gave everything away in negotiations. "The Halloran operation has been running for 3 years," he said. "Land fraud, protection rackets, trafficking. I've been tracking it for about 8 months. On whose behalf?" "Nobody's." She looked at him. "I'm not working for a county office or a federal agency," he said. "I'm not collecting a bounty. There's no bounty on Marcus Halloran because nobody in official capacity has had the nerve to put one up." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm here because I tracked one of his trafficking routes to a family I'd been—" He paused, edited something. "To some people I knew, out of Harker's Bend." Pearl's words from last night came back to her. Nobody talks about how it got cleaned out. "You were in Harker's Bend," Elena said. "I was in Harker's Bend," he confirmed and didn't elaborate. "And the people you were tracking to Halloran, dead," he said, flat and simple. "By the time I traced the route, 3 months ago." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Elena didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned that sorry was often just noise people made to make themselves feel less helpless, and that sometimes the better thing was to just let the weight of something sit where it sat. "So this is personal," she said. "It's personal," he agreed, "which is relevant to you because it means I don't have backup, I don't have official sanction, and if this goes wrong, there's no one coming to sort it out afterward." "What does going right look like?" He set down his cup. "There's enough evidence in that compound to bring down the entire operation. Not just Halloran himself, but the buyers he works with, the men who supply his weapons, the people who've been filing the fraudulent deed transfers at the county seat. Everything. I've spent 8 months building a picture of how it connects." He looked at her steadily. "What I need is to be inside long enough to find where he keeps the actual records. Deals like his, there are records. Leverage over buyers, leverage over sellers, insurance against the people above him turning on him. He'll have it somewhere. And your cover story, the federal judge, the maps, buys me time inside. Not much. Cutter's already suspicious. I saw it yesterday. And Halloran's going to send someone to the county seat within the next day or two to ask questions I can't answer." He leaned forward slightly. "I need someone on the outside." Elena put her coffee down. "Me." "You have reasons to be moving around," he said. "You're a property owner with a legitimate grievance against the gang. You can talk to people without it looking like organizing. You know this town, you know who's been hurt by them, who's angry enough to act, and who's too scared to be useful. Most of the people in that square yesterday fall in the latter category," she said. "Fear moves," Creed said. "It's not fixed. People who are scared and passive become something else when they see a path that doesn't end with them dead or dispossessed." He paused. "You said you could ride and shoot." "I said that. I need someone who can carry messages I can't risk sending through town. I need someone who can get to the Garza Ranch and the Morrow spread and find out how many men those families have, who can handle themselves. And I need someone who, if everything goes wrong, can get to the Territory Marshal's office in Dunmore before Halloran's people can stop them." "Dunmore is 40 miles, Elena said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving the dry grass in the field, the sound of it a low rush through the gap in the wall. "The Garza family," she said. "Tomas Garza had a brother, Ramon. The Hallorans took his cattle 2 years ago, said it was a debt payment for protection he'd never agreed to. Ramon tried to fight it legally, and they ran him out of the county." She paused. "Tomas is scared, but Ramon's name still does something to his face when you say it." Creed looked at her. "That's useful." "The Morrow sisters lost their water rights. Halloran's men diverted the creek that fed their upper pasture. Deliberately. Agnes Morrow filed a complaint at the county seat, and it disappeared." She picked up her coffee again. Agnes carries a Winchester and isn't scared of it. How do you know all this? Because I've been here my whole life, and I pay attention, she said, a little sharply. And because when nobody thinks you matter, they talk freely around you. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a piece of information being filed in a place where it would be used later. There's something else, Elena said. She got up, went to the floorboard, came back with the piece of paper she'd written on last night, unfolded it and set it in front of him. 47 names. People who were in that square yesterday. I know most of their situations. Who's behind on protection payments, who's lost what to the gang, who's got family somewhere that Halloran might use against them. She tapped the paper. If you want to know what you're working with, start there. Ronan Creed looked at the list for a long moment. Then he looked at her. You wrote this last night, he said. Couldn't sleep. When did you decide to help? Elena considered the question honestly. I'm not sure I decided, she said. I think I just understood that waiting for someone else to fix this had a 0% success rate. He was quiet. Then, Halloran's going to increase pressure on you. He can't auction you again without losing face, but he'll find other ways. You need to be careful. I've been careful, she said. Careful didn't stop me from ending up on that platform. No, he said. It didn't. He folded the list and put it in his coat pocket. I need to be back at the compound before Cutter does head count. I told him I wanted to look around town before committing. He stood up. Don't go to the Garzas or the Morrows yet. Wait until I get word to you. There's a particular thing I need to find first. If it isn't where I think it is, none of the rest matters. The records, she said. The records. She walked him to the door. He stepped out, and she noticed in the morning light that he moved differently than she'd initially catalogued. There was something deliberate in the way he placed his weight, the way his eyes tracked the perimeter of the yard before he stepped off the step. Not nervous. The opposite of nervous. The kind of hyper-awareness that had become so habitual it looked like calm. One more thing, she said. He stopped. Yesterday. Why me specifically? She'd been turning this over all night. You rode into an auction with 120 people and one man you'd apparently been hunting for 8 months. There were other people on those platforms before me. There were others he was going to take. She paused. Why stop at mine? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. I've been in this territory 6 weeks, he said. I've been watching Halloran's operation. I know his land fraud targets, his supply routes, his buyers. He looked at her directly. 3 days ago, I watched Diggs come to your door with a torch, and you held a shotgun on him and told him you'd burn down the house before you'd sign. She stared at him. Followed him back, waited outside, watched you through the window for an hour after he left, he said, and there was no apology in it, just the matter-of-fact account of surveillance. You sat at your table, and you shook for about 5 minutes, and then you got up and you fixed the latch on your door, and then you sat back down and wrote something, and then you went to sleep. He paused. Most people after that, they run or they give in. You fixed the latch. Elena wasn't sure what to say to that. I needed someone with enough to lose that they'd fight, he said, and enough sense to do it smart. You fit. He walked across the yard to his horse, which he'd left tied at the far fence post, away from the house where it wouldn't be visible from the road. Mounted without ceremony. Looked back at her once. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. I'll get word to you. He rode north. Elena stood in her doorway and watched the gray horse until it disappeared over the low ridge, and then she stood a moment longer looking at the empty land. Her land, the 43 acres her parents had turned from nothing into something, the frost still on the brown grass, the sky going pale yellow in the east. She fixed the latch. That detail sat in her chest in a complicated way she didn't have words for. That he'd seen that it had mattered. She went back inside, poured what was left of the coffee, cold now, but still actual coffee, and sat at her table and picked up the pencil and started a new list. Not names this time, logistics, distances between properties, horses she knew were available and who owed her enough to lend one without asking questions, supplies, routes that stayed off the main road, the kind of thinking that was, she recognized, The thinking of someone who had committed to a thing before they'd fully worked out whether the thing was survivable. She wrote for an hour. By the end of it, the yellow light had become real morning, gray and flat and cold, and somewhere out toward the compound 2 miles north, Ronan Creed was sitting across from Marcus Halloran and maintaining a lie that had a 3-day expiration date. She was going to need those 3 days to count for something. She capped the pencil, folded the second paper, put it in the tin box with the first one and the land deed and her mother's ring. Stood up, put on her coat. The Morrow sisters' spread was 6 miles east. Agnes Morrow was up before dawn, and Elena knew it, because Agnes Morrow was the kind of woman who got up before dawn so the day couldn't get ahead of her. Creed had said to wait for word. Elena thought about that for a moment. Thought about the auction platform, and the hammer, and the fraction of a second between going twice and the sound of those hoofbeats. She put on her hat and went to saddle her horse. Agnes Morrow was not what Elena had expected. She'd met Agnes before, in the way you met everyone in a territory this size. At supply runs, at the occasional gathering that passed for community and Black Ash Crossing, at the kind of brief intersections that constituted social life on the frontier. But she'd never sat across a table from the woman with something specific to ask, and there was a difference between knowing someone by sight and knowing what they were made of. Agnes Morrow was 61 years old, built like a fence post, and had the eyes of someone who'd stopped being surprised by bad news sometime in her 40s. She listened to Elena without interrupting, which was itself a kind of respect. Her sister Dora sat in the corner of the kitchen mending a harness and did not look up, but Elena noticed that her hands slowed down and eventually stopped while Elena talked. When Elena finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The man who wrote in yesterday, Creed." "Yes." "He's inside the compound now." "As of this morning, yes." Agnes looked at her coffee cup. "What happens if his cover breaks before he finds what he's looking for?" "Then we move with what we have," Elena said, "which is why I'm here now instead of waiting." Agnes looked up. "What do you need from me?" That was the moment Elena understood that she'd been right to come without waiting for Creed's word. Some things didn't benefit from caution. Some conversations needed to happen while people were still running on the particular fuel that anger provided, before they had time to talk themselves back into the safer position of doing nothing. "I need to know how many people you can bring," Elena said. "People who can handle themselves. People who won't freeze." Agnes turned to look at Dora. Some communication passed between the sisters that Elena couldn't read. Years of living in close quarters had given them a shorthand that was nearly silent. "4," Agnes said. "My men plus 2 from the Kettrick place. The Kettrick boys are young, but they're not soft." She paused. "And Dora." Dora looked up for the first time. "I shoot better than any of them," she said mildly, and went back to the harness. Elena left the Morrow spread an hour later with 4 confirmed and a route east to the Garza Ranch already mapped in her head. The frost was melting off the grass by then, the morning softening slightly, though the cold didn't go anywhere. It just became less aggressive about announcing itself. Tomas Garza was harder. He met her at his gate rather than inviting her in, which told her something about the state of his nerves. He was a broad man in his 50s, dark-haired, going gray, with hands that had done 30 years of hard work and showed it. He listened to her the way a man listened to someone delivering bad news he'd already been expecting, braced, tight around the eyes, not quite meeting her gaze. "I've got a wife," he said when she finished. 3 kids still at home." "I know," Elena said. If this goes wrong, Halloran's men burn you out eventually anyway," she said. "Not today, but when the next piece of land he wants is yours." She paused and then said something she hadn't planned to say. "Ramon would have come, Tomas." It was a harder thing to say than she'd expected, and she could see it was a harder thing to hear. Tomas Garza's face went through something private and painful and then settled into something else. Not anger exactly, but a relative of it, the kind of feeling that had been compressed into a small space for a long time. "Ramon would have come the first week," Tomas said quietly. "I know." A silence. The wind moved the dry grass along the fence line. "How many you got so far?" he asked. 6 confirmed, plus myself." I've got two hands who aren't family, he said. Men who know what they're doing. I won't bring them into this without telling them the risk. I wouldn't want you to. Give me until tonight, he said. She gave him until tonight and rode back toward town on the long way around, staying off the main road, cutting through the dry creek bed that ran parallel to the Halloran compound's eastern fence line. She didn't stop or slow down. She didn't look toward the compound, but she counted the guard positions she could see from the creek bed, 2 on the north watchtower, 1 near the main gate, 1 she could just make out moving along the south fence, and filed it away. Creed's word came on the second day. Not in person. He was too visible at the compound to risk another trip to her property. It came through the young rider, Tad, which surprised her enough that she almost didn't open the door when she heard the knock. But Tad stood on her step, looking profoundly uncomfortable, like a man who had been asked to do something he didn't entirely understand and was trying very hard not to think about what it meant. He handed her a folded piece of paper without saying anything. Then he turned and walked back toward the road. "Wait," she said. He stopped, didn't turn around. "How long have you been with them?" she asked. A pause. 8 months? Before that? Another pause. Longer. Cattle work, down south. What happened? He turned then, just part way, enough that she could see the side of his face. He was maybe 17, maybe 18, with the kind of face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like. "Same thing that happened," he said. "Drought. Outfit went under. Halloran's men were the ones hiring." Elena looked at him. "You were in that square yesterday," she said. "When they were, She stopped. "When I was on the platform." He looked at the ground. Said nothing. "If something happens in the next few days," she said carefully, "something that goes badly for the Hallorans, would you get in the way of it?" He was quiet for so long she thought he was going to walk away without answering. Then he said, very quietly, "Cutter killed a man 2 weeks ago. For talking back." A pause. He was just a farmer who said the wrong thing." Tad shook his head slightly. "I'm not getting in the way of anything." He walked to his horse and rode back toward the compound. Elena went inside and unfolded the paper. The note was short, written in a tight, economical hand. Records in main house. Second room off kitchen. Locked trunk, southwest corner. Buyers arriving day after tomorrow. Auction of current captives. 30 people minimum. I'll move during the auction. Maximum distraction. Need your people in position at the east fence by the 3rd hour of dark. Signal, 3 lanterns, Canyon Ridge. She read it twice. Burned it in the cook stove. 30 people. The word captives sat in her chest like something with weight. She'd known the trafficking operation was ongoing. Everyone knew, the way you knew about something you couldn't see directly but could feel the outline of. But 30 people made it concrete and terrible in a way that abstract knowledge hadn't. The rest of that day she spent moving. She went back to Agnes Morrow, confirmed the plan and the timing. Agnes listened, nodded, and said she'd have everyone staged at the Kettrick place by nightfall the following day. She went to Tomas Garza, who met her at the gate again, but this time opened it. Both his hands were standing behind him, hats in hand, with the look of men who'd made a decision and were committed to it even if they weren't happy about it. Tomas had brought them in. That was 8, plus Elena. She went to Doc Pruitt's house in town and knocked on the back door. The doctor was a small man, white-haired, with a tremor in his left hand that he managed carefully. He'd been in that square, he'd looked at the ground, and she'd been carrying some anger about that. But she needed him, and being angry at him was a luxury she didn't have. He answered the door, saw her face, and said, "Come in." She didn't sit down. "I need you to have medical supplies ready," she said. "The night after tomorrow. Whatever you'd need for gunshot wounds, burns. I don't know exactly what we're going to be dealing with." He looked at her for a long moment. His left hand was trembling slightly. "Elena," he said, "I was in that square. I know. I should have—" "Doc," she said, "I need to know if you'll be ready." He closed his mouth. Something in his face shifted the way Tomas Garza's had. Not quite relief, but adjacent to it. The relief of being asked to do something concrete after a long time of doing nothing. "I'll be ready," he said. She spent the evening at Pearl Dunbar's saloon, not drinking, sitting in the back where she could see the door and think. Pearl brought her coffee without being asked and didn't ask questions. Amos Hecht came in around 7, got a drink, saw Elena in the back, and came over with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized, the look of someone about to offer an apology that was also an excuse. She stopped him before he could start. "Can you open the feed store tomorrow night and leave the back unlocked?" she said. "I might need a place to move people through." He blinked. People. People who need to get out of the Halloran compound without being seen on the main road. He was quiet. "How many people?" "I don't know yet. Possibly more than 30. Amos Hecht was not a brave man. Elena had always known that. He was the kind of man who did his business carefully, paid his protection without complaining, and went to sleep at night by not thinking about the things he didn't want to think about. But he was also, underneath all of that, someone who'd grown up in this territory and had an idea of what it was supposed to be that the Halloran operation had been slowly grinding down for 3 years. "Back door will be unlocked," he said. He finished his drink and left without saying anything else. By the time she rode back to her property that night, she had 11 people. 11 people, a route, a signal, and a plan held together with the particular fragile confidence of something that had not yet been tested against reality. She was almost asleep when she heard the sound outside. Not hoofbeats this time. Footsteps. More than one person, moving without lights, coming from the direction of the road. She was off the cot and at the north window, the one with the burlap, before she was fully awake, her hand on the shotgun. She eased the burlap aside a half-inch. 2 men she didn't recognize, moving toward her front door, both armed. Behind them, at the edge of the road where the light didn't reach, she could just make out a third figure on horseback. She didn't think. She went to the door, shot the bolt, moved to the corner by the cook stove, not the wall beside the door, which was the first place anyone came through a door would look, and held the shotgun level. The knock, when it came, was hard. Official. The kind of knock that was also a statement. "Miss Voss, come out and talk." She recognized the voice. Cutter. "I'm comfortable in here," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Halloran has some questions for you about a visitor you had 2 mornings ago." There it was. Someone had talked, or Cutter had been watching the property and had seen Creed leave, or the compound had fewer blind spots than she'd assumed. Any of those options led to the same place. The cover was cracking faster than 3 days. "I have visitors sometimes," she said. "It's not unusual." "This visitor," Cutter said, "was seen leaving your property before dawn. Around the same time he told Mr. Halloran he was in the saloon." A pause. "Mr. Halloran finds that interesting?" Elena pressed her back against the wall. The cook stove was still warm from the evening. She could feel it through her shirt. She was thinking fast and not entirely cleanly, which she recognized as the effect of being woken from a half-sleep into danger. The shotgun had 2 shells. There were at least 3 men outside. The back of the property was open ground, 50 yards of it before she hit the tree line, and in the dark, on foot, 50 yards was a long way to be in open ground. "Tell Mr. Halloran I'll come see him tomorrow," she said. "It's late. He'd prefer now." She was calculating if she went with them, she was inside the compound with no plan and no backup, and whatever cover Creed had been maintaining was gone. If she didn't go, they'd come through the door, and the same result followed, just louder. The third option was the one she took. She went to the south window, the one facing away from the men, and eased it open with her left hand, shotgun still in her right. The window was small. She was not a large person. She went through it feet first, dropped into the frost-hard dirt, pressed herself flat against the wall of the sod house, cold through her shirt, heart going hard enough that she could feel it in her ears. The footsteps moved toward the front door. One of them, not Cutter, said something she couldn't make out. A boot hit the door, not quite a kick. She ran for the tree line. She heard Cutter shout behind her. Not a full shout, controlled, the sound of a man who didn't want to fire a gun in the dark and announce himself to the whole territory. She went into the trees at a dead run, dodging by feel rather than sight, branches catching at her face and hair. Behind her, she could hear one of them giving chase, crashing through the brush with less care than she was taking. She knew these trees. She'd played in them as a child. She cut left at the big fallen cottonwood she'd climbed 100 times, ducked under the branch that hung at shoulder height, went right at the rocky outcrop that marked the edge of her father's old fence line. The man behind her hit the branch. She heard him curse. The crashing footsteps slowed. She kept going. She ran until she was certain no one was behind her, and then she ran a little further, and then she stopped, pressed her back against a pine, and stood in the cold and the dark and caught her breath. Her feet were in shoes this time, at least. Small mercies. She couldn't go back to the house. That was clear. She couldn't contact Creed directly. She had no way to reach him without going through the compound's front gate, and that was not an option. The plan was for the night after tomorrow, and suddenly she wasn't sure the plan had the night after tomorrow to wait for. She stood in the dark woods and made herself slow her breathing and think. Cutter had been sent to bring her in. That meant Creed's cover was suspicious, but probably not blown yet. If Halloran had known for certain, Cutter wouldn't have knocked. He would have come with more men and less conversation. There was still a thread of plausibility Creed was working with, but it was fraying, and the moment Halloran connected Elena's disappearance tonight to Creed's early morning absence 2 days ago, the thread would snap. She needed to move the timeline. She pushed off the tree and started moving east through the woods toward the morrow spread. 6 miles in the dark. She could do 6 miles. She'd done worse. The night was very clear, stars hard and bright and cold overhead, the kind of sky the territory produced in October when the clouds finally went somewhere else. Her breath made small clouds in the air in front of her. The shotgun was heavy in her hands, and she shifted it to her shoulder and kept moving. She thought about 30 people locked in the Halloran compound. She thought about Creed inside, working whatever margin he had left, doing the math the same way she was, and probably coming to the same conclusions. She thought about Tad, 17 or 18, cattle work, same thing that happens, and wondered which side of this he was going to land on when the night came. She walked faster. Agnes Morrow opened her door before Elena knocked, which meant she'd heard the footsteps on the frozen path, which meant Agnes Morrow slept light and kept a rifle by the bed. Elena filed this as an asset. "Tonight," Elena said, without preamble. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Agnes looked at her. The state of her, branches in her hair, no coat, running on fear and forward momentum, and said, "Come in. I'll get the others." They moved out at the second hour of dark. 11 people. Agnes and Dora Morrow, the 2 Kettrick boys, who turned out to be men in their mid-20s, which Elena counted as a relief, Tomas Garza and his 2 hands, and 4 others who Agnes had quietly gathered from neighboring properties over the past day. People whose names Elena barely knew, but whose faces she recognized from the square on auction morning. People who'd stood there looking at the ground. People who apparently had been looking for a door. They rode without lights, spread out enough that they wouldn't sound like a single group if someone was listening from the compound. Agnes had given Elena a coat and a pair of gloves without being asked, and Elena had put them on without argument. Dora Morrow rode at the back of the group with her Winchester across her saddle and said nothing to anyone the entire way out. Elena led them on the long route through the dry creek bed, coming up to the east fence of the compound from the low ground where the canyon wall cut the sight lines from the watchtowers. She'd walked this stretch in her memory a dozen times since reading Creed's note, mapping the guard position she'd observed, calculating where the gaps were. In practice, in the dark, it felt different than it had in her head. The canyon was deeper than it looked in daylight. The fence was higher. The compound on the other side of it was lit with lanterns that cast moving shadows she couldn't entirely read. She held up her hand and the group stopped. 3 lanterns on the ridge, she said low. That's the signal. We don't move until we see it. What if the signal doesn't come? One of the Garza hands asked. His name was Everett, and he'd been quiet the entire ride out, which she'd decided was a sign of sense rather than reluctance. Then we wait until we have to make a decision, Elena said. But it'll come. She said it with more certainty than she felt. She didn't know what was happening inside the compound. She didn't know if Creed's cover had fully broken after Cutter's visit to her property or if he'd managed to patch it. She didn't know if he'd found the records. She didn't know a great many things, and the not knowing was a physical sensation, a tightness across her chest that she kept having to breathe through. They settled in along the base of the east fence, horses tied back in the tree cover, people spread in pairs with enough distance between them that a single shot couldn't take out 2. Agnes had organized this without being asked, moving people with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd thought through the tactical problem on the ride over. Elena watched her do it, and felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Gratitude, maybe, mixed with the particular relief of not being the only person who knew what they were doing. They waited. The first hour was the worst. Nothing moved inside the compound except the shadows from the lanterns and the occasional guard making his rotation along the fence line. The guard on the east side came past their position twice, close enough that Elena could hear the scuff of his boots on the frozen ground, and both times the group went absolutely still. The second time, she heard Everett breathing too loud beside her, and she put her hand on his arm without looking at him. The breathing slowed. Tomas Garza was on her other side. He'd been still the whole time, but not the stillness of calm. The stillness of someone holding something in with both hands. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he kept his eyes forward. Ramon would have been better at this part, she said very quietly. Not to say anything useful, just to say it. Tomas was quiet for a moment, then. Ramon was never good at waiting either. He'd have done something stupid by now. A pause. But he'd have done it confidently. That was his thing. Maybe don't do anything stupid, Elena said. Maybe, Tomas agreed. It wasn't a promise. Inside the compound, something changed. She heard it before she saw it. Voices, higher in pitch than the ordinary background of a guarded compound, and then the sound of movement, the kind that suggested a lot of people being directed somewhere against their will. The lantern light shifted as people carrying lights moved from one part of the compound to another. The buyers, she thought, arriving early, or the auction starting ahead of schedule. Either way, it meant the captives were being moved and consolidated, which meant whatever Creed was planning, the window was narrowing. She looked at the ridge above the compound's north side. Dark. Still. Come on, she said under her breath. The second hour stretched. The compound sounds continued, voices, movement, the occasional sharp word that carried over the fence without being clear enough to understand. One of the Kettrick boys, the younger one, whose name she'd learned was Cal, shifted position and winced, and she glanced over and saw him rubbing his left knee. He caught her looking and mouthed, "Old injury," and she nodded and looked away. None of this was clean. None of it was what it looked like in the stories people told, where the heroes positioned themselves and the plan unfolded and everyone was exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. Real waiting was cold and dark and involved sore knees and breathing too loud and the specific uncertainty of not knowing if the person you were depending on was still alive. She was thinking about that, about Creed, inside, doing whatever he was doing with whatever time he had left, when the ridge lit up. 3 lanterns. Fast. 1, 2, 3, spaced across the canyon wall like fixed stars, burning orange against the black rock. Agnes said, from somewhere to Elena's left, "That's it." Elena was already moving. She'd planned to go over the fence at the section between the Eastern Guard's rotation points, a gap of about 4 minutes between passes based on what she'd observed. She went up and over with more noise than she'd wanted, caught her coat on the top rail, jerked it free, dropped to the other side. Tomas was right behind her, then Agnes, then the others coming over in pairs. Inside the compound, the ground was churned mud and old straw, and the lantern light threw everything into patches of orange and deep shadow. She could hear the auction, or what was being conducted as an auction, coming from the central yard, voices and a sound of many people gathered, the same quality of theater she'd heard from Griff's voice in the square 3 days ago. A market. The language of commerce applied to human beings. It made her jaw ache. She went left towards the main house because that was where Creed's note said the records were, and she needed to find him before she did anything else. And because she had a strong feeling that if the records existed in that trunk in the southwest room, they needed to come out of the compound regardless of what else happened tonight. The main house was a converted ranch structure, large by compound standards, 2 stories, with a covered porch running along the front. The back of it faced the east fence and was less guarded, the assumption being that the fence itself was the security layer. Elena moved along the wall of the structure toward the back door, staying in the shadow. The back door was open. That stopped her for a second. Open doors in the middle of the night in a place like this were either traps or signs that something had already gone wrong inside. She looked at Tomas, who was right behind her. He looked at the door. She held up 3 fingers, 3, 2, 1, and went through. The room she entered was a storage space, mostly. Barrels, crates, saddle equipment hung on pegs. A lamp on a shelf near the door, lit low. She moved past the storage and through the interior door into what was clearly a kitchen. A large one, a working fireplace, a table that could seat 8, smelling of cooked meat and smoke. The second room off the kitchen. She found it. A door, closed. She tried the handle. Locked, as Creed's note had said. She looked at Tomas, who understood without being told. He put his shoulder to it twice, and on the second try it gave with a crack of splitting wood that was too loud and they both froze. No response from anywhere in the house. She went into the room. Small. What had probably been a pantry, shelves along 2 walls now empty, and in the southwest corner, a trunk. Iron-banded, padlocked, roughly the size of a large traveling case. She looked at the padlock and then at the room and found, on the second shelf, a hammer that someone had left for some other purpose entirely. 4 hits. The padlock hasp gave on the 4th. Inside, paper. A great deal of it. Folded documents, bound ledgers, loose pages covered in small, neat handwriting. She grabbed the nearest ledger and opened it to the middle and stood there in the low light reading for 30 seconds. Names, dates, amounts, locations. Property transfer records cross-referenced against a second column she recognized, after a moment, as the names of buyers. Buyers of land, buyers of livestock, buyers of people. Everything cross-indexed, everything with names on it. The names of the people who'd purchased the fraudulent deeds. The names of the men who'd supplied the trafficking operation. The names and amounts and dates going back 2.5 years. Halloran's insurance policy. His leverage over everyone who'd ever done business with him. Which meant it was also, in the right hands, a complete record of the entire operation. She closed the ledger, grabbed everything she could reach, and handed it back to Tomas, who'd produced a canvas sack from somewhere, she didn't know where, she didn't ask, and was packing documents into it with focused efficiency. When the trunk was clear, she took the sack. From outside, somewhere in the central yard, she heard the sound of the auction collapse. It wasn't the clean pop of a single gun, it was the cascade of it. One shot, then several in quick succession, then shouting, then a sound like many people moving at once, chaotic and fast. The particular noise of a situation becoming uncontrolled. She heard someone scream, high and sharp, and then a lower sound she recognized after a second as a crowd of captives running. "That's it," she said unnecessarily, because Thomas already had the sack over his shoulder and was moving back through the kitchen. The compound outside had reorganized itself into chaos. She could see it through the kitchen window. Halloran's men moving toward the central yard, which meant away from her, which was the point. Creed had done something to pull attention to the center, and whatever it was working. The east fence behind the house was briefly unguarded. She went out the back door and into the yard, Tomas behind her. Agnes Morrow was coming from the direction of the east fence with Cal Kettrick and Dora, moving toward the central yard from the side. She caught Elena's eye and jerked her chin toward the building on the north side of the compound, a long, low structure she'd identified from outside as a holding area. Elena nodded. They went for the holding building. The door wasn't locked. It had a bar across it from the outside which told her everything she needed to know about the people inside. She lifted the bar. Tomas pulled the door open. The smell hit her first. Close air, unwashed bodies, fear that had been contained in a small space long enough to become its own atmosphere. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw them. Men, women, 2 children she hadn't expected, sitting or lying on the floor of what had been a barn, looking at the open door with an expression she'd seen on cornered animals. The particular blank terror of something that had been afraid long enough that a new stimulus registered as threat, before it registered as rescue. "You need to get up," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "We're going out the east fence. Stay close, stay quiet until we're clear." Nobody moved for a second. "Now," Agnes Morrow said from behind Elena, and whatever quality Agnes's voice carried in that moment, command, certainty, the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. It worked. People started moving, 31 of them. She counted as they came through the door, 31, including the two children who couldn't have been older than 9 or 10, holding hands with the concentrated grip of siblings who'd agreed somewhere back down the line to not let go no matter what. Getting them to the fence was not clean. Two of the people from the holding building couldn't move fast, an older man with a bad leg, a woman who seemed dissociated, moving on instruction but not entirely present. Everett, the Garza hand, took the older man's arm without being asked. One of the Kettrick boys carried the woman. Elena kept moving, counting, keeping the group together as best she could while the sounds of fighting from the central yard went through phases. Gunfire, shouting, a crash she couldn't identify, more shouting. She got them to the fence. Over was harder than she'd planned. 31 people, some of them injured, some of them barely coherent, over a 6-foot fence in the dark. Agnes had anticipated this. She'd left a rope on the outside and Cal retrieved it and they improvised. And it was ugly and it took too long and twice she heard someone running inside the compound and held her breath until the footsteps went in a different direction. The two children went over the fence without rope, without difficulty, with a matter-of-fact competence that briefly wrecked her. She was the last one over. She dropped to the outside of the fence and stood in the dark of the canyon and did a head count. 31 from the building, 11 of her people, herself. 43 total, moving on foot and horse through the dark toward the tree line. She didn't see Creed. That was the thing she didn't let herself think about while she was moving, while she was counting heads and helping the woman who wasn't quite present and watching the perimeter for anyone following them out. She kept it in a compartment. The fact that he wasn't with the group. The fact that the sounds from inside the compound had gone quieter in a way that didn't feel like resolution. The fact that she didn't know. They got the freed captives moving toward the creek bed. Agnes directed them, Dora on one side, Everett on the other, moving the group toward the Morrow spread where there was space, warmth, and Doc Pruitt, who Elena had sent word to before they left. She stood at the edge of the tree line with the canvas sack over her shoulder and Tomas Garza beside her, watching the group disappear into the dark. Go with them, she told Tomas. What about go with them, she said. The sack goes to Agnes. If I'm not at the Morrow place by morning, she takes it to the county seat herself. Tomas looked at her, at the compound behind her. Elena, Tomas, go. He went. She turned back toward the compound. She found the section of fence where the post was loose. She'd noted it on the way out, and went back over, which was harder alone without the rope. And she tore her coat on the rail again in the same place, and landed harder on the inside than she wanted to, jarring her ankle enough to make her eyes water. Inside the compound was quieter now. The central yard had gone from full chaos to something more like aftermath. She could hear voices, but fewer of them, and they had the quality of people who'd won or lost and were figuring out which. She moved toward the sound along the wall of the main house, staying in shadow. She found Creed at the base of the watchtower. He was sitting with his back against one of the support posts, one hand pressed to his right side, breathing in the careful, measured way of someone managing pain. The watchtower above him was dark. The lanterns that had been burning up there were out. There was debris around him, broken wood, and she understood that something structural had happened up there, and he'd come down from it without a rope. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. I told you to get them out, he said. They're out, she said. She crouched down next to him and moved his hand away from his side to look, and he let her, which told her something about how he was feeling. The coat was dark there. She couldn't see how bad it was. Can you walk? I can walk, he said. He didn't move. Creed. Give me a second, he said. He sounded annoyed, which she decided to count as a positive indicator. She looked at the compound around them. 3 of Halloran's men were down in the central yard. She could see them from here, not moving. 2 more were being held at gunpoint by people she recognized, which meant some of the freed captives had found weapons during the chaos and made decisions about what to do with them. She didn't see Halloran. Where is he? She asked. Creed was quiet for a moment. Then, he went over the north fence, maybe 10 minutes ago, before the tower came down. A pause. He took 2 men with him and a saddlebag. I don't know what was in it. The records, she said. We got the records. He looked at her sharply. The trunk in the southwest room, she said. It's gone. Agnes Morrow is taking it to the county seat. Something moved through his expression. Relief, probably, though it was the compressed kind that didn't look like what it felt. The ledger with the red binding, he said. That's the key document. If that's in the trunk, everything was in the trunk, she said. We took everything. He put his head back against the post and closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he opened them and looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize as his version of direct. Halloran's going to run, he said, tonight. If he's smart, and he is, he's already figured out the records are gone and he knows what that means. Without leverage over his buyers and suppliers, he's exposed on every side. So we need someone to follow him. Someone already is, he said. He looked like he was about to say something else and then changed it to, help me up. She helped him up. He got his feet under him and stood, and he was right that he could walk, though the walking was effortful in a way he was clearly trying not to show. She got herself under his left arm, and he put a moderate amount of his weight on her shoulder. Not all of it, which she suspected was pride, but enough that it was real. They went toward the east fence. The tower, she said as they walked. What happened up there? Halloran made a speech, Creed said, before the buyers arrived. Put me up front so the crowd could see the partner he'd acquired. A pause. It seemed like a good place to make noise. You deliberate. She stopped, started again. You let him put you in front of everyone on purpose. Maximum visibility, he said. You needed the distraction. She didn't say anything to that for a moment. They reached the fence, and she looked at it and looked at him and said, This is going to be ungraceful. Most things are, he said. Getting him over the fence was, in fact, ungraceful. But they got over it. And on the other side, in the dark of the canyon, with the sounds of the compound behind them settling into the specific quiet of something that had broken and wasn't going to reassemble itself the same way, Elena stood in the frost and looked at the stars and breathed. The children, Creed said, from the holding building. They make it out? All 31, she said. Clean. He nodded, said nothing more. They walked toward the tree line, toward the Morrow spread, toward Doc Pruitt and the canvas sack full of names and dates and the long accounting of 3 years of damage. Behind them, the compound burned. Not all of it, just the watchtower where something had caught in the fall, the orange of it reflecting against the canyon wall in a way that was almost beautiful from a distance. Elena didn't look back. She had 43 acres of bottomland, a man with a wound she needed Doc Pruitt to look at, and a sack of documents that were going to answer a great many questions that a great many people had been afraid to ask out loud. It was, she thought, a start. Doc Pruitt worked on Creed's side for the better part of 2 hours. Elena sat in Agnes Morrow's kitchen and listened to the sounds of it through the wall. The occasional sharp intake of breath, the low murmur of Doc's voice, the clink of instruments she didn't want to think about too specifically, and drank coffee that tasted like nothing and stared at the canvas sack on the table in front of her. 31 freed people were distributed through Agnes's barn and the Kettrick bunkhouse and the back room of the feed store in town, where Amos Hecht had apparently shown up in the night and unlocked every door he had without being asked twice. Thomas Garza had ridden for his own property to check on his family and then turned immediately around and come back. Dora Morrow was at the barn with the Winchester, which was less about the freed captives and more about the possibility of Halloran's remaining men deciding to follow. Nobody had followed. The compound, by all reports from Cal Kettrick, who'd gone back to look, was empty. Whatever men had been there that weren't down in the yard were gone, scattered into the territory the way that kind of organization scattered when the center stopped holding. The watchtower had burned to the foundation. The holding building stood open and dark. Marcus Halloran was somewhere north, with 2 men and a saddlebag, running. Elena knew she should sleep. She also knew she wasn't going to. She opened the canvas sack and spread the contents across Agnes's kitchen table and started reading. The ledger with the red binding was exactly what Creed had said it was. Names, dates, amounts, a complete operating record of 3 years of fraud, extortion, and trafficking. She recognized some of the names immediately. 2 county officials, A land agent out of the territorial capital who'd processed the fraudulent deed transfers. 3 buyers she'd never heard of, from locations as far as 200 miles away, whose names appeared in the trafficking columns with frequencies that made her stomach turn. And the property records. Page after page of them. Every family that had been defrauded, every piece of land that had been taken through coercion and falsified paperwork. The Kettrick place, the Bowers, old miner Sweat's claim up on the ridge. 14 properties in all, within a 50-mile radius, their real deeds held somewhere in Halloran's system while fraudulent transfers sat on file at the county seat. Her own land was on page 37. Elena Voss, 43 acres. Cutter Creek bottomland. Transfer attempted, refused. Notation beside it in a different hand, smaller and sharper than the main entries. Alternative measures taken. She sat with that for a moment. Alternative measures. That was what she'd been to them. A line in a ledger. A problem to be resolved through other means. She closed the ledger and put it back in the sack. Doc Pruitt came out of the back room sometime around 4 in the morning, rolling down his sleeves, looking like a man who'd done a difficult thing and was glad it was done. He sat down across from Elena and accepted the coffee she poured without being asked. 2 broken ribs, he said, 1 cracked, a gash along the right side that needed closing. It'll scar, but it missed anything vital. He paused. He's been walking around with at least one of those ribs broken for a while. Before tonight. Elena looked at him. Weeks, I'd guess, Doc said. Old injury, not properly rested, which probably accounts for some of the... He paused, choosing his word. Efficiency of his decision-making. Pain does something to people's relationship with caution. She thought about Creed riding into the square, into the middle of 11 armed men, offering $121 like it was a business transaction. She thought it was control, that unhurried quality. Now she thought it might have been something else too. The particular recklessness of someone who had already decided that the cost-benefit calculation of his own safety was secondary to something else. Can I see him? She asked. He's awake, Doc said. Against my recommendation. She went into the back room. Creed was sitting up in the narrow bed, which was also against Doc's recommendation, judging by the look of it. He was propped against the wall rather than lying down, with the careful positioning of someone managing pain by controlling angle. His coat was off, and his shirt had been cut away on the right side, the wound closed with neat stitches and bandaged. In the lamplight, he looked like what he was, a man in his early 30s who had spent those years harder than most, and was currently paying installments on the accumulated cost of that. He looked at her when she came in, looked at the state of her, the torn coat, the mud on her boots, the branches she probably still had in her hair. The records, he said. On Agnes's kitchen table, she said. All of it. The red ledger and everything else. Something in him settled. Not relaxed. Settled, like a structure that had been under strain and had the weight taken off it. The county seat, he said. Agnes needs to go today. Not tomorrow. Today, before Halloran can get word to anyone there who might make things disappear. I'll go, Elena said. It should be me. He looked at her. They're my land records too, she said. I have standing. Agnes is a witness. I'll take Agnes, but I'm the one who files the complaint. She paused. You're staying here until Doc says otherwise. That's not Creed. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. You have 3 broken ribs and stitches, and you fell off a watchtower. You're staying here. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd cataloged over the past 4 days. The one that was calculating but not cold. That was adding things up and deciding what to do with the sum. Then he said, There's a man in Dunmore. Name is Aldous. Territorial Marshal's Office. 15 years, honest as anyone I've met in this work. If you go to the county seat and they stall you, and they might, there are names in those records who have reasons to make this slow. You go to Aldous directly. Tell him I sent you. You know him. Harker's Bend, he said. It was becoming a kind of shorthand between them, the thing that explained things without requiring explanation. She nodded. Aldous, Marshal's office. Show him the red ledger first, the trafficking records. That's federal jurisdiction. It goes over the county officials' heads entirely. He stopped, breathed carefully around what the talking was doing to his ribs. The land fraud is important, but the trafficking is what brings the weight down fast. All right, she said. A silence. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to do the first tentative thing it did before dawn. Not lightening exactly, just becoming slightly less absolute in its darkness. The people from the holding building, Creed said. What happens to them? It was the question Elena had been sitting with since the barn. 31 people. Some of them from territories far enough away that going back was a complicated proposition. Some of them who'd had homes and land and livelihoods that the Halloran operation had destroyed before or alongside taking them. 2 children whose origins she didn't yet know. I don't know yet, she said. I've been thinking about it. The compound, he said. The structures that are still standing. It's on disputed land. Halloran claimed it under one of his own fraudulent transfers, which means when those transfers are voided, the land reverts. He looked at her steadily. Someone would need to file on it, establish a legitimate claim. She looked at him. That's a complicated thing to suggest to someone who can barely keep one property together. I'm not suggesting you do it alone, he said. Another silence. This one had more inside it. Get some sleep, she said. She stood up. I'm leaving for the county seat at first light. I'll be back in 2 days. Elena. She stopped at the door. What you did tonight, he said. Organizing those people, moving the timeline when it needed to move, going back in for the records. He paused. I came into this territory thinking I was going to do it alone, the way I've done everything. I want you to know that what happened tonight, the part that worked, that was you. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about the auction platform, the hammer, the fraction of a second. She thought about the list of 47 names she'd written in the dark, and Agnes Morrow opening her door, and Thomas Garza's face when she'd said Ramon's name, and Amos Hecht unlocking every door he had. She thought about 31 people coming out of a holding barn into the dark and moving toward the tree line, and 2 children going over a 6-foot fence like it was nothing. Get some sleep, she said again, and went back to the kitchen. She left for the county seat at first light with Agnes Morrow and the canvas sack and a letter in Creed's handwriting, produced somehow between Doc's visit and dawn, addressed to Marshal Aldous in Dunmore. Agnes rode the way Agnes did everything, straight-backed and without unnecessary comment, and Elena was grateful for it. She didn't have much conversation in her. She had 40 miles of road and a sack full of evidence and the particular focused quiet of someone who had decided what they were going to do and was doing it. The county seat was a town called Harlow, bigger than Black Ash Crossing by 3 times, with a proper courthouse and a land records office, and unfortunately a county sheriff whose name appeared twice in Halloran's ledger. Elena had read the entries. She knew what they meant. She had decided what to do about them before they arrived. She went to the land records office first, not the sheriff, filed the challenge to the fraudulent deed transfers for all 14 properties, with the original deeds photocopied from Halloran's records as supporting documentation. The clerk behind the counter was a young man who looked at the volume of paper she was presenting and at her expression and made the wise decision to process it without asking difficult questions. Then she went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Marshal Aldous in Dunmore. Not the full contents of the letter, too long for a wire, but enough. Records recovered from Halloran compound Black Ash Crossing. Trafficking evidence, federal jurisdiction, carrying documentation. Arrive tomorrow. Sent by R. Creed. The response came back in 40 minutes. Come directly. Bring everything. Aldous. She spent that night in Harlow at a boarding house where Agnes knew the proprietor. She slept for 10 hours without dreaming. The meeting with Marshal Aldous the following afternoon lasted 3 hours. He was a man in his late 50s, gray and deliberate, who read the red ledger with the concentrated focus of someone absorbing a document they intended to act on. He asked questions, specific, precise questions about the timeline, about the compound, about the disposition of Halloran's men, about Creed, about the current status of the freed captives. Elena answered everything she could and said plainly what she didn't know. When she finished, Aldous set the ledger down and looked at her across his desk. The county sheriff in Harlow, he said. Page 12, second column, she said. 2 entries. Protection payments from the Halloran operation, dated 8 months apart. Aldous nodded slowly. I'll be sending deputies. To Black Ash Crossing? To Black Ash Crossing, to Harlow, and to 3 other locations in these records. He looked at the sack. This is a substantial piece of work, Miss Voss. It's not mine, she said. Ronan Creed spent 8 months building the picture. I just helped carry it out. Aldous looked at her with the expression of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know what they were looking at. From what you've described, he said, carrying it out was the part that mattered. Marcus Halloran was caught 11 days later, in a way that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had preceded it. He'd been heading for the territorial border, the 2 men with him, moving fast but not fast enough. Aldous had wired ahead, and Halloran rode into a marshal's checkpoint 40 miles north of Black Ash Crossing and found people who knew his name and were expecting him. The saddlebag he'd taken from the compound turned out to contain approximately $2,000 in cash and a revolver and nothing else. Whatever he'd hoped to preserve by running, the records Elena had taken from the trunk had already made irrelevant. He was held in the territorial jail in Dunmore, pending federal hearings. The hearings, when they happened 6 weeks later, were thorough and damaging and involved 17 defendants in total. Halloran, 2 county officials, the Harlow sheriff, a land agent, several buyers. The ledger with the red binding was entered as the primary evidence. The trafficking charges carried the heaviest weight, as Creed had said they would. Elena wasn't at the hearings. She was in Black Ash Crossing, which by that point had more than enough to occupy her. The 14 properties with voided fraudulent transfers needed their legitimate owners notified and reinstated. Some of those owners were still in the territory and came back to their land with a combination of disbelief and furious energy, reoccupying properties they'd been dispossessed of anywhere from 6 months to 2 years prior. Some had left and needed to be located. Elena wrote letters, a lot of letters. Her handwriting improved considerably over the course of November. The compound was a more complicated matter. The land claim process took longer than she'd hoped, and there were periods of waiting that felt like standing still when everything in her wanted to move. But by December, the legal standing was established. The main structures, the converted ranch house, the barn, several outbuildings, were intact and usable. The watchtower foundation was a scorched square of earth that she decided, after looking at it once, she didn't need to rebuild. The 2 children from the holding barn were named Petra and Miles. They were siblings, 8 and 10, from a homestead 80 miles south whose parents had been killed and whose existence Halloran's records had, in their thoroughness, actually documented. Names, origins, dates. Elena had written that letter first to the children's aunt in Kansas and received a response in 3 weeks that made her sit down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands for a moment before she could continue. The aunt came in January. She was a small, serious woman named Ruth who looked at her niece and nephew with an expression that had too many things in it to name, and took them home, and wrote Elena a letter afterward that Elena kept. Doc Pruitt, it turned out, had been wanting to expand his practice for years, and had lacked the space. He set up 2 rooms in the compound's main house as a proper medical facility, the first Black Ash Crossing had ever had, and stopped apologizing to people for the limitations of what he could do. Amos Hecht donated lumber. He announced this at a town meeting, the first real town meeting Black Ash Crossing had held in 4 years without armed men at the door, and seemed to stand slightly straighter afterward, the way a person stood when they'd done something they'd been meaning to do for a long time. Agnes Morrow filed a complaint about her water rights through the newly reinstated county legal process, and the diversion of Cutter Creek was reversed by March. The first time the water ran back into her upper pasture, she stood and watched it for a long time without saying anything, and Dora stood beside her, and that was that. Tomas Garza got a letter from his brother Ramon in November. Elena didn't read it. It wasn't hers to read, but she saw Tomas the day after it arrived, and she didn't need to ask what it had said. Some things showed in a person's posture before they ever opened their mouth. Creed stayed. That was the part Elena hadn't been certain of, the part she'd been careful not to assume. He'd been mobile again within 2 weeks of the compound raid, Doc Pruitt's objections noted and overruled, and she'd half expected him to be on his horse and gone before she got back from Dunmore. He wasn't. He was at Agnes's place, helping Cal Kettrick repair a fence line, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone respecting their stitches, while also being constitutionally incapable of sitting still. He didn't explain it. She didn't ask him to. There were things that people did that explained themselves if you let them, and Creed was apparently the kind of person who communicated in actions more than words, which Elena was finding, as time went on, that she didn't mind. He was useful. That was a plain fact. He knew land law well enough to help navigate the property reinstatement process. He knew how criminal operations structured themselves, which meant he understood which of Halloran's remaining men were dangerous and which had simply been employed and frightened, and that distinction mattered when people started drifting back into the territory and the question of what to do with them arose. He had a way of being in a room that made people speak more carefully, which was sometimes exactly what was needed. He also, she discovered, fixed things. Physical things. The gap in her sod wall that had been letting cold air in since August was patched without comment one morning while she was in town. The north window with the missing glass was replaced. Actual glass. She had no idea where he'd gotten it. He didn't mention either of these. She didn't mention that she'd noticed. The frontier was not a place where things resolved cleanly. She knew that. The hearings in Dunmore were long and contentious, and there were moments when it looked like money and political connection might blunt the edge of the evidence, and Aldous had to fight for it in ways that were unglamorous and exhausting. 2 of the 17 defendants had their charges reduced in exchanges she found infuriating. The county sheriff got 3 years rather than the 10 he deserved, in her estimation. 14 families got their land back. 31 people who'd been held in that barn went home, or to whatever constituted home now, or began building something new. The records from the Red Ledger became the basis for a territorial land fraud reform that took another 2 years to fully implement, and was imperfect when it arrived, and was nonetheless better than what existed before. None of it was a clean story with a clean ending. None of it should have happened in the first place. The Kettrick homestead that had been burned was not rebuilt by the act of justice. The family rebuilt it themselves, slowly, over the following year. And it was hard work, and it didn't look the same as before, and Tom Kettrick said once, to Elena, that he didn't expect it ever would. She understood that. She felt it in her own land, in the 43 acres of bottomland along Cutter Creek that she walked every morning in January while the frost was still on the grass. The land was the same land her father had cleared and her mother had planted. The legal status of it had been restored, but something had happened to it, in the time when it was threatened, that had changed what it meant to her. It was still hers. It felt more preciously hers than it had before. And it also felt, she searched for the honest word, fragile. In a way it hadn't when she'd taken it for granted. She thought about that a lot, in the months that followed. She thought about what it meant that the people who'd looked at the ground in the square on auction morning had become the same people who'd gone over a fence in the dark and held a rifle and unlocked every door they had. They hadn't changed. The circumstances had changed. Someone had shown them a door, and they'd gone through it, and discovering that they could do that had done something to them that wasn't reversible. Amos Hecht still wasn't a brave man in the way that word usually applied, but he'd donated lumber, and he'd come to the town meeting and stood slightly straighter, and those were real things that hadn't existed before. Fear didn't make people permanently small. It just made them small while it lasted. And the thing about fear, the thing she'd had to learn from the inside of it, standing on a platform in the cold with her hands bound, was that it only lasted until something else became more important, until the thing you were afraid of losing became more present than the fear of losing it. She'd refused to sign the deed transfer because losing the land was, in that moment, less tolerable than the fear of what refusing would cost her. That was the whole of it. Nothing heroic, just a calculation that came out a particular way because she valued one thing more than she feared another. She thought everyone in that square had made the same calculation, eventually, and come out the same side when the stakes were clear enough. On a cold morning in February, 4 months after the auction that had started all of it, Elena was standing at her kitchen table reading a letter from Ruth in Kansas. A proper letter, 3 pages, with a drawing that Petra had done of what Elena supposed was the Kansas farmhouse, though it looked more like a square with windows, when she heard the familiar sound of boots on the step. Creed knocked. He always knocked. even though she'd told him twice he didn't need to. "Come in," she said. He came in. Stood at the door the way he always stood at first, taking account, old habit, probably not voluntary. Then he settled and looked at the letter in her hand. "Ruth?" Petra drew a picture, Elena said, holding it up. He looked at it. "That's a house?" Apparently, he came to the table, looked at the drawing more closely. "The proportions are wrong." "She's 8, Elena said. "The windows are in the right place," he said. And that was him being generous, and she knew it, and she appreciated it. She put the letter down and looked at him. 4 months had done something to him that she noticed in small ways. He held himself slightly less like someone expecting a door to open badly. He still counted exits, she thought, probably always would. But there were moments now when she caught him not doing it, standing at the fence at the edge of her property in the early morning, just looking at the land without assessing it for threats. And those moments had become more frequent. "Tad came by the compound yesterday," he said. Tad had stayed. That had surprised her at the time and now felt like something she should have expected. He was working honest cattle work for the Kettrick outfit, learning things he'd apparently always wanted to learn and hadn't had the circumstances for. "What did he want?" she asked. "To see if we needed hands," Creed said. "Come spring, when the building starts." She looked at him. "And do we?" The we sat between them for a second, occupying the space it occupied, which was real, and had been real for a while, even without being named. "Probably," he said. "Tell him yes," she said. She picked up the letter again. "There's coffee." He went and got it. Sat down across from her at the table the way he'd sat on that first morning 4 months ago, before everything, when he'd knocked on her door with 2 cups and a story she couldn't yet read the truth in. The same table. Different everything else. Outside, the frost was on the brown grass, the sky going pale yellow in the east. The land beyond the window was hers, legally, unambiguously, with the paper trail to prove it. And it was also, she'd come to understand, something more than a legal designation. It was the place where her parents were in the ground, and where she'd grown up, and where she'd been afraid, and where she'd decided that afraid wasn't enough of a reason to stop. It was 43 acres of bottomland that someone had decided was worth auctioning a human being to obtain, and it had turned out to cost them considerably more than that. She thought sometimes about what the territory would say about all of it, when the story passed into the kind of talk that frontier communities used to make sense of things. Stories always simplified. The person who refused to sign became a symbol of something. The man who wrote in became a legend, which was a kind of prison, if you let it be. The truth, that it had been 11 imperfect people in a canvas sack and 31 people going over a fence in the dark, and someone fixing a window without mentioning it. The truth was harder to carry in a story. But it was the truth, and Elena had decided she'd rather have the truth than the cleaner version. She drank her coffee. Creed drank his. Outside, the pale yellow light became real morning, the same way it always did. Not all at once, but incrementally, 1 degree at a time, until suddenly it was simply there. The day that Black Ash Crossing had decided to become something different from what it had been was 4 months behind them. The day it would finish becoming that thing was still a long way ahead. In between was just the work. The letters and the lumber and the fence lines and the water running back into pastures that had been dry. The town meeting without armed men at the door. Petra's drawing of a house with windows in the right place. The small, specific, unheroic accumulation of ordinary life rebuilt after damage, which was, Elena had come to think, the only kind of rebuilding that lasted. She picked up her pencil and wrote back to Ruth in Kansas. She started, as she always did, with the land.